go. I chose the topic today of a sense of self, and I wanted this one to be one of the more exploratory ones, right? Some topics favor us. Some topics favor us having more of what might be like a sermon, right, where somebody gives a very talk and there's a very clear position and all of that, and that's a valuable thing in some circumstances. But sometimes it's also good and worthwhile for us to have explorations, to just sort of think about ideas from different angles and different approaches. And even if it doesn't land on one crisp, clear conclusion, learning to see things from different perspectives, to use different ideas, to appreciate different things can be valuable. So this one's gonna be kind of an exploration. I'll push in a direction. We'll see. Curious to develop our talk from this. I did want to get away from talking about the pandemic for a little bit because we've been obsessing about that, and sometimes that's unhealthy, right? It'll be a little bit better to think about something else. So let's think about the sense of self. This is something that's been coming up in some of our previous conversations. We have been talking about building connections, right? And how we needed a community, right, to fit in. We've talked about experiences that people have had where they didn't fit in, right? Where they changed, where they were part of a church or some kind of community, and the ideas didn't work for them. And so they bailed, right? Because it wasn't for them. How their lives had reached different points. Some people who talked, their lives have reached different points that they needed to reorient, right? To make a dramatic shift, to make a change in sort of who they are and how they fit in. And we've talked about selfishness, right? People taking too much for themselves and the way that that's hurting our world and our community. All of this is kind of floating around this concept of a sense of self, right? And who we are and how we fit in. So maybe we need to think about this sort of as humanists, right? What can humanists say about the sense of self more generally that might guide us in thinking about sort of all of those different things? Okay. I like to get maps, right? Mental maps that'll lay out different kinds of positions, because then I can pay attention to different concerns as they come up or as they disappear in one way or another. So let's start with this idea of an atomistic self. That's what it gets called, an atom, right? It's a self-contained unit. Right, the self is a natural unit of its own, right? Any relationships it has with other things are accidental, right? It would stay the same even if those relationships changed. I think the paradigm for this is usually the immaterial soul, right? You say God created you with an immaterial soul, and that soul is what it is. You are what you are, right? And it doesn't matter what context you go into, what situation you are in, what role you play in life. You are sort of fundamental underneath that, right? There's something essential that is you. That doesn't have to be religious in its formulation, right? As long as there is this idea that there's something fundamental that makes you what you are, that you see in different contexts. Okay, so how does this come up? This comes up, I mean, in terms of Christianity and Christian religion, in terms of thinking about the soul in different roles and different positions. So there's the claim that all humans are equal, but then the compatibility of that with various social hierarchies, various social positions, various social changes. Say yes, but then in the day, right, in heaven, everybody will now be back to their fundamental thing. I think that runs through a lot of Western cultures, Christian cultures, this idea that the self is really basic, individual, and fundamental. One of the key elements of that, though, is that how you know what you should be doing then from this kind of self is you're looking for your calling. That's usually the language they like to use, right? That there is some sort of calling that is being made, being given to you by God, being assigned to you by God, that then tells you what you are supposed to do, right? So we're all fundamentally selves, and then some people have been called to be healthcare workers, right, in this circumstance, and some people have been called to be something else. I think it's a familiar way of thinking about the self, and a familiar way of thinking then about your life and how that guides your direction of life. Humanist critics, a lot of them, of course, are going to have questions about this immaterial soul. Like, where is it? How do we find it? Where does it come from? They don't tend to believe in that kind of immaterial soul, or if they do, not in their focus on humanism says that we're going to be able to understand ourselves by looking at the world as we see it and not appealing to some invisible, unscientific, impossible to find sort of direction. I think for a lot of humanists, this question about the immaterial soul looks an awful lot like a kind of bad faith, right? If you want to say, I am called to do this or that, really what you're doing is hiding a decision that you made, right, underneath this claim of being called. That really what you're doing is hiding a decision that you made and accrediting God with that decision. You're saying, God told me to do this, or God told me to do that, when really, fundamentally, it's you that made that decision and not something else calling you or making you do that. Of course, that criticism, right, makes it tempting to say there is nothing that makes you you. That fundamentally, right, there is nothing there except for a choice of what you want to be or what direction you want to go. This is famously associated with and the existential, right, with his existence precedes essence. I'm not sure how helpful that is in most cases to put it that way. It's more a question of looking at your life and saying, you simply have to choose what direction to go. Do you want to become an engineer or a nurse? Do you want to identify yourself with your job or what you do in your leisure time? Do you want to, whatever direction you might want to go? It's fundamentally a question of choice. Nothing about you is going to determine that choice. Yeah, so maybe you have, I don't know, skill at math and the kinds of things that an engineer would need. That doesn't matter. That doesn't determine what you should do. That doesn't make it something that you should do. It might make it easier or harder, but just because something's easier or harder doesn't mean you have to choose it or avoid it. You could say it's easy, but I don't choose that. I choose something else. I often think of people I've known who've made significant changes in their life. One in particular who, after graduation, took off to Washington, and for a long time she had been in politics, and then 360-degree turn, she's now a vicar in England, just with no, sort of retreating from the world and the connection. Like, you can choose which direction you want to go. It's not something that's fixed. It's not something that has to be there. Okay, so this is a different view. This is sort of the opposite view. It's still an atomistic view, right? It's down to you individually to give you your sense of self, your direction, where you go. I think there's something right about that these are choices. I think that seems hard to deny, that there are choices that are involved. But it doesn't seem to catch other parts of our experience, right? Sometimes where you are and what you're doing just seems to fit. Right? It seems to work. It seems to be a fit for you in one way or another. Sometimes it doesn't, right? Sometimes you're bumping up against it. It seems unimportant or unconnected or just not working for you, even though you might have chose it, right? It's not that it was forced on you, it's that you chose it, but it's not fitting. Sometimes things don't satisfy, right? You've chosen something and it's not making you happy, right, the way you thought it would. I think this is a very common thing. People think something will make them happy and it doesn't make them happy. That we're not very good judges of that is a classic piece of psychological literature. So sometimes things fit. Sometimes they don't satisfy you. Sometimes a situation really does seem to call for your action or your response. I think this is most obvious to us in situations of emergency, right? Where you might have a sort of hero response. That is, somebody has to jump in and deal with it. It seems like the situation just calls for you to engage. So choice catches something, but not everything. So let's think about another view. The Buddhists, right? Fundamental claim from the Buddhists is that the self is the source of suffering, or sometimes that word is translated dissatisfaction. So this is suggesting that all of our suffering and dissatisfaction is a result of the way that we perceive the world, the way that we think about the world. We perceive the world and think about the world in terms of ourself, right? This will be good for me, or this will be bad for me. This is happening to me, or it's happening to somebody else. This is being taken from me. This is being given to me. Like, the self is a fundamental category that we use to perceive the world. And that category is precisely the source of all of our anxiety and dissatisfaction. If you worry about losing your health, it's because you think about it belonging to you, right? That it's somehow your health that's disappearing and not just that there is health out there that's coming and going in a natural flow. if you worry about losing your money, it's not just, again, something coming and going, right? It's me that I'm going to be missing it. That's why I'm anxious about this prospect, this problem. And so the basic idea, the core idea for the Buddhists, Nirvana, right, the thing that they're aiming for, even translates sort of to be blown out. So the idea would be that after practice and exercise and thinking, you learn to perceive the world without yourself, right? You to blow yourself out. And then you will lose, right, one of the sources of unease and dissatisfaction, or not one of the sources, the source of unease and dissatisfaction that there is in the world. So maybe on this vision of the self is a bad thing, right? It's something we need to get rid of all of our problems. All right, I mean, I can certainly see elements to that, that often much of your anxiety and frustration does stem, right, from thinking about yourself and the way that you fit in. Where I find difficulties with this view are in some basic things. Self-respect seems like a good thing. That is, somebody who doesn't have enough self-respect, someone who does not value themselves enough, someone who lets other people walk all over them. That seems like a bad thing. But in order to have self-respect, you need to value yourself, right? You need to have a self, and you need to say that that self is important. In another dimension, we also tend to value individuals, right? It matters who is there, not just the role that they're playing, not just the situation. And valuing those individuals is a source of love. It's a key element of compassion. It's a key element of many good things that we can experience in life. Yes, that's also where losses come from. That's also where damage can come from, right? So the possibility of loving a particular individual also raises the possibility of that love ending or decaying, or that individual not returning that love. So yes, it can be a source of suffering, but it's also a source of some very good things, some of the best things perhaps in our lives. So maybe that Buddhist view, right, that the self is the source of all suffering and should be blown out, maybe the price of that view is too high. It certainly seems like a lot to take that on. So perhaps the problem is with the assumptions that we have been making, right? I said this is an atomistic view. The self is fundamental. There's another set of views about the self that might be helpful for us to remember. And that is that the self is relational. That is, who you are depends on how you are related to other people. Probably best illustrated in Confucius's thought, thinking about the ideas there. Because the way that he would think of the world is to look at your roles and then think about your obligations and what you need to do. So you are a son or a daughter, and that tells you what you need to do and who, right, you owe those obligations to, right? Son owes his mother certain kinds of respect, certain kinds of treatment, certain kinds of attention, certain kinds of time. And those obligations are not just to mothers, like all of them out there, any of them, but to one particular one. So it's that relationship that determines who that person is. We have roles at work, we have friends, we have all kinds of relationships that we are lodged in. And that those relationships are what make us what we are. If those change, if those break, if those are destroyed, then in some fundamental way, we change, we break, we're altered. Now, this view has the nice aspect of being able to explain like community and connection and why that is so important. The atomistic view of the self seems a little bizarre. If you just are, right, that self, then why is it that we need other people and want to connect to other people? Why is it that community is important? This seems a little more natural way to be able to explain that. The nature of your community helps tell you who you are and how you connect. On this front, though, it seems obvious to me that a culture or a network of relations that you're lodged in might not fit somebody. I think many of us have had that experience at one point or another. That is, you're playing the role that you need to play. You're being the person that you need to be for other people, and it's not working for you. You're feeling disconnected. You're feeling alienated. You're feeling frustrated. Depending on the particular role, it might be oppressive, right? It might be actually unjust, but it doesn't have to be for it to just not fit you, or maybe no longer fit you. Which can make us very tempting to go back to where we started and say, oh, there's some essential me there underneath. There's some person that I have to find, right? And I need to walk away from all my connections in order to find it. It seems like we've kind of looped back around to the beginning. But there might be another way to think about this. And I think this is a way that humanism can kind of direct us to think about it, because humanism doesn't need any of these absolute visions. That is, it doesn't need to say fundamentally that we are any one of these things. Humanism can borrow from all of them. So there's no need for a metaphysical soul to distinguish me from others. And I can be identified in that way. The kind of organism I am, I'm a moderately social organism. I like that angle. We were talking about bees earlier. Bees are highly social organisms, right? They fit in their place. They go exactly where they do. There doesn't tend to be any level or very little level of individuality, if you're going to find any within that space. Humans aren't like that. But they also aren't completely independent, running on their own. They function well in moderate-sized social groups. They need to connect and have some disconnection, right? They have a little of both. They need to matter to themselves, and they have some places where they need to matter to others and connect to others. Just recognizing that can help us navigate what sounded so difficult before, right? Over the course of my life, it makes sense that it would be appropriate for me to emphasize each of these different aspects of myself at some point or other. At some point or other, it may be most helpful for me to think about my life as a free choice that I make, and that there is nothing within me that is going to answer that question and settle it for me. I have to make those decisions. I have to make those choices. But other times it might be valuable to recognize that I don't feel like I fit. And so something might need to change, right, in order to alter that fit. Something might need to shift. It's valuable to pay attention to our relationships, to keep them healthy and strong, but not to let them be too much, overcome, right, any other senses that you might have. Just because you're in a relationship of one kind or another doesn't mean it's perfect, or that it needs to stay forever, or that it determines everything about you. And I think in particularly, we need to learn to hold ourselves loosely. That's the broad advice I think I would take from this. That is, hold ourselves loosely. That is, we matter some, but it's easy to make too big a deal out of the self. It's easy to miss the insights that the Buddhist offers about the way clinging, right, to things for myself and by myself overlooks or causes me to suffer rather than making me happier. That is, trying to hang on to my stuff, right? Worrying about whether I'll lose it instead of accepting a kind of flow where things come and go. These can often cause suffering and be bad, but not necessarily always. So I think humanism, I don't know, my feeling from this exploration is that humanism can let us look at these different dimensions and think about which of these different dimensions we might need at any particular time in our life. It's tempting to grab one of them and claim that is the entire story, that's the whole thing. I think humanism should resist that kind of thinking, that it's unlikely that there is simply one thing that we are, one answer that then sets us up for the rest of our life. Instead, thinking about who we are is going to be something that is shifting and changing over time. That's going to require us to emphasize connections at some point and pulling away at other points. They're going to recognize that we will feel like we fit sometimes, and sometimes it won't matter so much if we feel like we fit. We need to do what needs to be done. Of course, that's still pretty vague advice. So I would be happy in the discussion time to talk a little more about different cases and different times when it comes up that way. But these are just sort of some thoughts that I had in talking about a sense of self.